They always told me I was the mistake, the one who should never have been born. The shadow no one wanted to see, my own family made sure I knew my place. They called me the failure daughter, the burden, the one who would never amount to anything, and for years I believed them. But what they didn't know was that their cruelty was shaping something inside me, something they would soon regret ignoring. My name is Elena Marsh, and this is the story of how I went from being the family disgrace to the woman who changed everything. I grew up in a house that never felt like home. My father, Richard Marsh, was a self-made businessman who built a logistics empire from the ground up. My mother, Vivian, was his loyal partner who handled the social side of things, always making sure the Marsh name carried weight in every room she entered. Then there was my older brother, Marcus, the golden child. The heir, the one who could do no wrong. And then there was me. I was born 6 years after Marcus, and from what I've gathered over the years, I wasn't planned. My mother never said it out loud, but I could feel it in the way she looked at me, like I was an interruption. A mistake that threw off the perfect balance they had created. Marcus got the attention, the praise, the opportunities. I got the leftovers. When I was 8 years old, Marcus won a regional chess tournament. My father threw a party. He invited business partners, relatives, even the mayor. I remember standing in the corner of that massive living room, watching everyone celebrate my brother like he had just conquered a nation. I had won an art competition at school that same week. I even brought the certificate home, hoping maybe this time someone would notice. My mother glanced at it for 2 seconds and said, "That's nice, dear," before turning back to talk about Marcus. That was the moment I realized I would never matter to them the way he did. As I got older, the comparisons became sharper. Marcus excelled in school, not because he was particularly brilliant, but because he had tutors, resources, and every door opened for him before he even knocked. I had to fight for scraps. I studied alone in my room while Marcus got driven to private coaching sessions. I asked my father once if I could join the same after-school program Marcus attended. He looked at me like I had asked for the moon. "That program is for serious students," he said. "You need to focus on getting your basics right first." Basics. As if I was so far behind, I didn't even deserve a chance. By the time I was 16, I stopped asking for anything. I learned to make myself invisible. I ate dinner in silence while they discussed Marcus's future. I stayed in my room while they entertained guests. I became a ghost in my own home. And the worst part? They didn't even notice. But I was paying attention. I watched how my father ran his business. I listened when he spoke on the phone about deals, contracts, suppliers. I read every business book I could find in his study when no one was around. I wasn't doing it because I thought they would ever let me into the family business. I was doing it because I needed to survive. I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't the failure they said I was. When I turned 18, I told my parents I wanted to study business administration. My father laughed. Actually, laughed. My mother just sighed like I had told her I wanted to become a circus performer. "Elena, be realistic," my mother said. "You've barely managed to keep decent grades. Business school is competitive. You wouldn't last a semester." Marcus, who was sitting across the table, didn't even look up from his phone. He just smirked. That smirk told me everything. He agreed with them. I was a joke, but I applied anyway. I worked 2 part-time jobs to save money because I knew they wouldn't pay for anything beyond the minimum. I studied every night until my eyes burned. And when the acceptance letter came, I didn't tell them. I just left. I moved into a tiny shared apartment near campus with 3 other girls. It was cramped, loud, and the heating barely worked, but it was mine. For the first time in my life, I wasn't surrounded by people who made me feel worthless. I was just another student trying to make it. College was hard, but not in the way my mother predicted. The coursework was challenging, sure, but I thrived on it. I loved learning about market strategies, negotiation tactics, supply chain management. I devoured every lecture, every case study. I joined clubs, attended networking events, volunteered for projects no one else wanted. I wasn't the smartest person in the room, but I was the most determined. And slowly, people started noticing. In my third year, I joined a student-led consulting group that helped small businesses with their operations. It wasn't paid, but it gave me real-world experience. One of the businesses we worked with was a struggling family-owned warehouse that was drowning in inefficiency. Everyone in the group wanted to move on to something more impressive, but I stayed. I spent weeks analyzing their workflow, cutting waste, renegotiating supplier terms. Within 4 months, their profit margins doubled. The owner, an older man named Mr. Patel, was so grateful he offered me a part-time position. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a foot in the door. I took it. I worked there throughout my final year of college, learning the logistics industry from the inside. I made connections. I asked questions. I absorbed everything. When I graduated, I didn't go back home. I didn't even tell my family. I sent a single text to my mother. I graduated. "Thought you should know," she replied 3 days later. "Good for you." That was it. No congratulations. No pride. Just a bland acknowledgement that I had done something they never believed I could. But I didn't need their approval anymore. I had something better. I had a plan. After graduation, I knew I couldn't just walk into a high-level position. I didn't have the connections Marcus had. I didn't have a family name that opened doors. What I had was grit, experience, and a growing network of people who actually respected my work. I stayed on full-time with Mr. Patel's company. It wasn't a corporate giant, but it was stable, and I was learning the kind of ground-level logistics operations that most business school graduates never touched. I spent my days coordinating shipments, managing inventory systems, dealing with suppliers who tried to overcharge us, and finding creative ways to cut costs without sacrificing quality. But I wasn't content to stay small forever. I started freelancing on the side, offering consulting services to other small businesses in the area. I worked nights and weekends, building a reputation as someone who could solve problems others couldn't. Word spread. Referrals came in. My client list grew. By the time I was 25, I had saved enough money to take a risk. I left Mr. Patel's company on good terms and launched my own consulting firm. It was just me, a laptop, and a tiny rented office space that doubled as a storage closet, but it was mine. The first year was brutal. I had a handful of clients, barely enough to cover rent and food. There were nights I sat in that cramped office wondering if I had made a terrible mistake. But every time I thought about quitting, I remembered the way my father dismissed me, the way Marcus smirked, the way my mother sighed. And I kept going. I started targeting mid-sized companies, businesses that were too big for basic advice but too small to afford the major consulting firms. I offered competitive rates and results-driven strategies. Slowly, clients started signing on. And I delivered, every single time. One of my early clients was a regional distribution company that was hemorrhaging money due to poor routing and outdated software. I redesigned their entire logistics network, cutting delivery times by 30% and reducing fuel costs by nearly half. The owner was so impressed he introduced me to 3 other companies in his network. That was the breakthrough I needed. By the time I was 28, my firm had a team of 6 people and a growing list of high-profile clients. We weren't massive, but we were known for getting results. My reputation in the industry was solid. People respected the Marsh name now, but not because of my father. Because of me. And that's when I heard about the Langford Project. Langford Industries was a massive conglomerate looking to overhaul their entire supply chain network. It was a multi-million-dollar deal, the kind that could make or break a consulting firm. Every major player in the industry was bidding for it, including my father's company. When I saw the request for proposals, I knew this was it. This was my chance to prove once and for all that I wasn't the failure they said I was. I wasn't going to just compete. I was going to win. I spent 3 months preparing that proposal. My team and I worked around the clock, analyzing Langford's operations, identifying inefficiencies, designing a system that would save them millions while improving delivery speeds. We didn't just offer a plan, we offered a transformation. When we submitted the proposal, I felt a strange mix of excitement and dread. I knew my father's company had submitted one too. I knew Marcus was probably involved. Part of me wondered if they even knew I was competing against them. The day of the final presentation came. Langford's executive board wanted to hear pitches from the top 3 firms they were considering. My company was one of them. So was Marsh Logistics. I walked into that boardroom in a sharp navy suit, my presentation loaded and ready, my team beside me. And then I saw him. My father, sitting on the other side of the room with Marcus and 2 senior executives from his company. The moment our eyes met, his face went blank. Then confusion. Then something close to anger. Marcus looked at me like he had seen a ghost. But I didn't flinch. I sat down and I waited for my turn. When they called my name, I stood up and delivered the best presentation of my life. I didn't just talk about logistics. I talked about vision, efficiency, scalability. I showed them data, projections, real-world case studies. I made them see what their company could become. When I finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then the CFO leaned forward and said, "This is exactly what we've been looking for." I didn't look at my father. I didn't need to. When his turn came, my father delivered a solid pitch, professional, polished, safe. Marcus stood beside him, nodding along like a trained parrot. It was the kind of presentation that would have won the deal 10 years ago. But not anymore. Not against what I had just shown them. 2 weeks later, I got the call. Langford Industries chose my firm. I sat in my office, staring at the contract in my hands, and for the first time in years, I let myself cry, not because I was sad. Because I had done it. I had actually done it. The news spread fast. In an industry as tight-knit as logistics, a deal like Langford didn't stay quiet. Within days, trade publications were covering it. My firm's name was everywhere. And so was my name. Elena Marsh, the consultant who beat out the legacy firms and landed the deal of the year. But the sweetest part? The headlines didn't just mention my name. They mentioned my father's company too, because we had gone head-to-head and I had won. I didn't reach out to my family. I didn't need to. I knew the news would reach them whether I said anything or not. And I was right. 3 days after the announcement, my phone rang. It was my mother. I stared at the screen for a moment before answering. "Elena," she said, her voice tight. "We need to talk." "About what?" I asked, keeping my tone even. "About this Langford situation." "Your father is very upset." I almost laughed. "Upset about what?" "That I won a contract fair and square." "You embarrassed him," she snapped. "You knew he was bidding for that deal. You should have stepped aside." "Stepped aside?" I repeated slowly. "Why would I do that?" "Because he's your father. Because this is his industry. You're making him look bad." I felt something cold settle in my chest. Even now, even after everything I had accomplished, she still couldn't see me as anything more than an inconvenience. "I didn't make him look bad," I said quietly. "I just did my job better." There was a long pause. Then she said, "You've changed." "Yeah," I said. "I have." And I hung up. 2 days later, Marcus called. I ignored it. He called again. And again. Finally, I answered. "What do you want?" I asked. "We need to meet," he said. "This is getting out of hand." "What's getting out of hand?" "You know what?" he said, frustration creeping into his voice. "You're turning this into some kind of revenge story. You're making us look like the bad guys." "I didn't make you anything," I said. "I just did my job." "If you have a problem with that, maybe you should have done yours better." He was silent for a moment, then he said, "Dad wants to see you." "I'm sure he does. Elena, just meet with him." "Let's settle this like adults." "There's nothing to settle," I said. "I won a contract." "That's it. If Dad has a problem, he can call me himself." But he didn't. Because deep down, he knew. He knew that if we sat down face to face, he would have to acknowledge what he had spent my entire life denying. That I was good at this. That I had earned this. That I wasn't the failure he said I was. Over the next few weeks, I focused on the Langford project. My team and I dove in, implementing the new system, coordinating with their operations managers, training their staff. It was intense, but we delivered everything we promised. ahead of schedule. The client was thrilled. They sent a formal letter of commendation. They referred us to 2 other companies in their network. The deal that was supposed to make my firm became the deal that launched us into a completely different tier. And my father's company? They lost more than just the Langford contract. Word got around that they had been outbid by a smaller, newer firm. Clients started questioning whether Marsh Logistics was still the industry leader. My father's reputation took a hit. Not because I sabotaged him, but because I proved there was someone better. Months passed. My firm grew. We hired more consultants, moved into a bigger office, took on projects I would have only dreamed about a few years ago. I was featured in industry panels, interviewed for business journals, invited to speak at conferences. People wanted to know my story. How did a no-name consultant beat the legacy firms? How did someone with no family connections build something this successful? I never mentioned my family in those interviews. I didn't need to. The story was powerful enough on its own. Girl from nowhere builds consulting empire through grit and strategy. That was the narrative. And it was true, but privately, I knew the real story. I knew what fueled me. It wasn't just ambition. It was everything they said I couldn't do. Every time my father dismissed me. Every time my mother sighed. Every time Marcus smirked. That was the fire that kept me going. One evening, I was working late in my office when my assistant buzzed me. "There's someone here to see you. No appointment. Says it's personal." I frowned. "Who?" "Richard Marsh." My heart stopped for a second. Then I took a breath. "Send him in." A minute later, my father walked through the door. He looked older than I remembered. Tired. His suit was still expensive, his posture still upright, but there was something different in his eyes. Something I had never seen before. Uncertainty. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking around the office. Taking it in, then he looked at me. "Elena," he said quietly. "Dad." He sat down across from me without being invited. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "I didn't think you'd actually see me." "I almost didn't," I said. He nodded slowly. "I deserve that." I didn't respond. I just waited. "I wanted to talk to you about what happened," he said. "With Langford. What about it? You won," he said simply. "Fair and square." "I know that." I tilted my head slightly. "So why are you here?" He hesitated. Then he said, "Because I was wrong." Those words hung in the air like something fragile. I had waited my entire life to hear them. And now that they were here, I didn't know what to do with them. "I was wrong about you," he continued. "I thought you didn't have what it took. I thought you were too soft, too unfocused. I thought Marcus was the one who would carry the business forward." He paused. "But I was wrong." "And it took losing a contract for you to realize that?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He flinched. "It took seeing what you built. Seeing you compete at that level and win. That's when I realized I had underestimated you." "Underestimated," I repeated. "Is that what you call it, Elena?" "You didn't underestimate me," I said, cutting him off. "You dismissed me. You treated me like I didn't matter, like I was a burden. Do you know what that does to a kid?" He looked down. "I know. Do you?" I leaned forward. "Because I spent years trying to get you to notice me, trying to prove I was worth something. And you never even looked. I see you now," he said quietly. "Now," I said. "Now that I'm successful. Now that I embarrassed you in front of your industry. Now, you see me." He didn't argue. He just sat there, looking older and smaller than I ever thought possible. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," he said. "I know I don't deserve that. I'm here because I wanted you to know that I'm proud of you, even if I have no right to be." I felt something crack inside me. But I didn't let it show. "You're right," I said. "You don't have the right." He nodded. Then he stood up. "I won't take any more of your time." He turned toward the door, and for a moment I thought about letting him leave. But then I said, "Dad." He stopped. "I didn't do this to hurt you," I said. "I did this because I had to prove to myself that I wasn't what you said I was." He turned back to me, and I saw something in his face that looked almost like regret. "You were never what I said you were," he said softly. "I just couldn't see it. And then he left. I sat there for a long time after he was gone, staring at the door. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt tired. But I also felt something else. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. Free. In the weeks that followed, I didn't hear from my father again. Or Marcus. Or my mother. It was like that conversation had closed a chapter I didn't even know was still open. And honestly, I was okay with that. I didn't need their approval anymore. I had spent too many years chasing it, and now I realized it didn't matter. What mattered was what I had built. My firm continued to grow. We landed 2 more major contracts, expanded into new markets, and even started getting international inquiries. The team I had assembled was brilliant, passionate, and hungry in the same way I had been. They weren't just working for a paycheck. They believed in what we were doing. I also started mentoring young professionals, especially women who felt overlooked or underestimated in male-dominated industries. I knew what it felt like to be invisible, to be told you weren't good enough, and if I could help even one person avoid that pain, it was worth it. One afternoon, I got an email that caught me off guard. It was from a journalist writing a feature story about family businesses and generational shifts in leadership. She wanted to interview me, but not about my firm. She wanted to talk about my family, about growing up as the overlooked child in a successful business family, about what it was like to compete against my own father. I almost deleted it. But then I thought about all the people out there who might be going through the same thing I went through. The ones who were told they weren't enough. The ones who believed it. So I agreed to the interview. We met at a quiet cafe downtown. The journalist, a woman in her 30s named Rachel, was kind and professional. She didn't push. She just listened. I told her everything. Not in a bitter way, not in a vengeful way. I just told her the truth about growing up feeling invisible, about being compared to my brother my entire life, about being called the failure daughter, about leaving home and building something on my own, about competing for Langford and winning. "Do you think your father regrets how he treated you?" she asked at one point. I thought about that conversation in my office. About the look on his face, about the words he said. "I think he does," I said, "but regret doesn't undo the past. It just changes how you move forward." "And have you forgiven him?" I paused. I don't know if forgiveness is the right word. "I've let go of the anger. I've stopped waiting for him to validate me." "But forgiveness? That's complicated." She nodded. "And what about your brother? Do you two talk?" "No," I said simply. "And I don't think we ever will. Some relationships aren't meant to be fixed." The article came out a month later. It was honest, raw, and beautifully written. Rachel didn't sensationalize anything. She just told my story the way I told it to her. The response was overwhelming. I got emails from strangers thanking me for sharing. People told me their own stories of feeling overlooked by their families, of being told they weren't good enough, of proving everyone wrong. But the message that hit me hardest came from someone I never expected. It was an email from Marcus. I read the article. It said, "I don't know what to say except that you were right. About everything. I'm sorry I never stood up for you. I'm sorry I went along with it. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know." I read it 3 times. Then I closed my laptop and went back to work. 2 years later, my firm became one of the top logistics consulting companies in the region. We had offices in 3 cities, a team of over 30 people, and a client roster that included some of the biggest names in the industry. I was invited to sit on advisory boards, speak at business schools, and mentor the next generation of entrepreneurs. And through it all, I never forgot where I came from. I never forgot what it felt like to be the girl no one believed in. One day, I got a call from Mr. Patel, the man who gave me my first real job all those years ago. He was retiring and wanted to sell his company. He asked if I was interested in buying it. I didn't even have to think about it. I said yes. We finalized the deal a few months later. I kept the name, kept most of the staff, and integrated it into my firm's operations. It felt like coming full circle. The place that gave me a chance when no one else would was now part of something bigger. At the celebration dinner, Mr. Indoor Patel raised his glass and said, "I always knew you were going to do something great. I just didn't know it would be this great." I smiled. "You gave me a shot when I needed it most. I'll never forget that." He nodded. "You earned everything you have. Don't let anyone tell you different." And I wouldn't. As I stood there, surrounded by my team, my clients, my mentors, I realized something. I had spent so much of my life trying to prove I wasn't a failure, trying to prove I was good enough, but the truth was, I had always been good enough. I just needed to believe it myself. The family that called me a failure? They were wrong, not because I became successful, but because success was never the measure of my worth. I was never a failure. I was just a girl who refused to accept the limits others put on her, and that refusal changed everything. Life settled into a rhythm after that. My firm continued to thrive, but I also learned to step back and let my team lead. I didn't need to control everything anymore. I had built something strong enough to stand on its own. I bought a house. A real one. Not a cramped apartment or a temporary space. A home with big windows, a garden, and enough room to breathe. I decorated it the way I wanted, filled it with things that made me happy. For the first time, I had a place that felt like mine. I also reconnected with some old friends from college. People who had supported me when I had nothing. We started meeting for dinners, weekend trips, just spending time together without the pressure of work or competition. It felt good to have people in my life who knew me before all of this, who liked me for who I was, not what I had accomplished. One evening, I was having dinner with Sarah, one of my closest friends from university, when she asked me something I hadn't expected. "Do you ever think about reaching out to your family?" Like, really reaching out? I took a sip of wine and thought about it. Sometimes. But I don't know what I'd say. "Maybe you don't have to say anything big," she said. "Maybe you just see where things are now." I nodded slowly. Maybe. A few weeks later, I sent my mother a text, just a simple one. "Hope you're doing well," she replied a day later. "I am. Thank you for asking." It wasn't much, but it was something. Over the next few months, we exchanged a few more messages. Nothing deep. Just small updates. She told me about a trip she took. I told her about a project I was working on. It was surface level, but it was civil. And for now, that was enough. I never reconnected with Marcus. And I was okay with that. Some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt. Some people are only meant to be part of your past. As for my father, I saw him once more, about a year after our last conversation. I was at an industry conference, and he was there too. We ran into each other in the hallway between sessions. "Elena," he said, his voice cautious. "Dad?" We stood there awkwardly for a moment. Then he said, "I've been following your work. You're doing incredible things. Thank you." He hesitated. "I know I have no right to ask, but I'd like to stay in touch, if that's okay with you." I looked at him for a long moment. I saw the man who dismissed me, who made me feel small, who never believed in me. But I also saw someone who was trying in his own flawed way to make amends. "We can stay in touch," I said, "but I need you to understand something. I don't need your approval anymore. I don't need your validation. I've built my life without it, and I'm proud of what I've done." He nodded slowly. "I understand." Good. And that was it. We didn't hug. We didn't have some big emotional reconciliation. We just acknowledged where we were and moved on, because that's the thing about healing. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's just quiet acceptance. Sometimes it's just learning to let go. 5 years after landing the Langford deal, I stood on a stage at a business summit, looking out at a room full of entrepreneurs, executives, and industry leaders. I had been invited to give a keynote speech about resilience and reinvention. As I stood there, I thought about the girl I used to be. The one who sat in the corner at her brother's celebration, holding a certificate no one cared about. The one who was told she'd never amount to anything. The one who believed it for far too long. And then I thought about who I had become. Not because of them, but in spite of them. I took a breath and began. When I was 8 years old, I won an art competition at school. I was so proud. I brought the certificate home thinking maybe this time someone would notice. But no one did. That day, I learned a painful lesson. I learned that in some families, in some spaces, there are people who will matter and people who won't. And I was taught, very clearly, that I was one of the ones who wouldn't. The room was silent. For years, I believed that. I believed I was the failure they said I was. I believed I wasn't smart enough, strong enough, good enough. And that belief almost destroyed me. I paused. But here's what I eventually learned. The people who underestimate you don't define you. The people who dismiss you don't determine your worth. You do. And the moment you stop waiting for their approval is the moment you start building something real. I looked out at the faces staring back at me. Some were nodding. Some had tears in their eyes. I didn't build my company to prove them wrong. I built it to prove to myself that I was capable, that I was enough. And along the way, I realized something. I had always been enough. I just needed to believe it. The applause started slowly, then grew. People stood. And as I looked out at that room, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Because I had done it, not by tearing anyone down, not by seeking revenge, but by building something I was proud of, by becoming the person I always knew I could be. And that was the real victory. After the summit, life continued to move forward. My firm kept growing, but I also started investing in other ventures. I funded startups led by people who reminded me of myself. People who had been overlooked. People who had something to prove. I wanted to be the person for them that I never had growing up. One of those startups was a logistics tech platform created by a young woman named Priya. She had pitched to dozens of investors and been turned down by all of them. But when she pitched to me, I saw something familiar in her eyes. That hunger. That determination. I funded her. And 2 years later, her platform became one of the most innovative solutions in the industry. She called me one day, almost in tears. "You changed my life," she said. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to thank me," I said. "Just do the same for someone else one day," and she would. I knew she would. Because that's how we change things, not by hoarding success, but by lifting others up. Around that same time, I started getting invitations to speak at schools. High schools, colleges, even middle schools. They wanted me to talk to students about entrepreneurship, resilience, overcoming adversity. At first, I wasn't sure I was the right person, but then I remembered what it was like to be a kid who felt invisible, who felt like they didn't matter, so I said yes. I spoke to auditoriums full of young people. I told them my story. I told them about being called a failure, about being dismissed, about leaving home with nothing but determination, and I told them the truth. You are not defined by what people say about you. You are not limited by where you come from. You are capable of more than you know, but you have to believe it. You have to fight for it, and you have to be willing to build something even when no one is watching. Every time I gave that speech, I saw kids who needed to hear it. Kids who looked like I used to look, and I hoped that maybe, just maybe, my words would plant a seed. A seed that would grow into something they could be proud of. 10 years after I left home, I received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from my father, handwritten. I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. Inside was a single page. "Elena, I know I have no right to ask for your time or your forgiveness. I know I failed you in ways I can never undo. But I want you to know that watching you build your life has been one of the greatest lessons of mine. You taught me that strength isn't loud. It's quiet, patient, and unbreakable. You are everything I should have seen from the beginning. I'm sorry it took me so long. I'm proud of you. More than you'll ever know, Dad." I read it twice. Then I folded it carefully and put it in my desk drawer. I didn't respond. Not because I was angry, but because I didn't need to. The letter wasn't for me to accept or reject. It was just something he needed to say. And I could let him have that. A year later, I heard that my father had stepped down as CEO of his company. Marcus took over. I didn't reach out. I just hoped, quietly, that Marcus would do better than our father had, that he would learn from the mistakes. And as for me, I kept building. I kept growing. I kept living a life I was proud of. Because at the end of the day, that was the only revenge I ever needed, not hurting them. Not proving them wrong in some dramatic showdown, just living well. Just becoming the person they said I could never be. And in doing that, I didn't just change my life. I changed the way I saw myself. I stopped being the girl who needed their approval. I became the woman who didn't. They called me the failure daughter. And for a long time, I believed them. I carried that label like a weight I couldn't put down. But somewhere along the way, I realized something. The label was never true. It was just their fear, their inability to see beyond their own expectations. I didn't need to prove them wrong. I just needed to prove to myself that I was capable. That I mattered. That I could build something meaningful. And I did. The people who underestimate you will always exist. The voices that tell you you're not enough will never fully go away, but you get to choose which voice you listen to. You get to choose what you build. I chose to build a life I'm proud of. A career I earned, a legacy that stands on its own. And that's the thing about being called a failure. It either breaks you, or it becomes the fuel that drives you to prove that failure was never the truth. It was just the beginning of something greater. I was never the failure daughter. I was always the woman who refused to stay small, and in the end, that refusal changed everything.